Here be giants. Giants in Shropshire Folklore. Written by Amy Boucher and read by Owen Staton. When you think of Shropshire, giants may not necessarily be the first thing that comes to mind. However, littered across the landscape are tales of giant beings, each with their own unique narratives. These creatures are somewhat underrepresented in discussions regarding our law, but despite this, I believe they are intrinsic to the county. They can symbolize the savage elements of nature which are in constant conflict with humankind. Furthermore, they come to symbolize the spirit of the land itself, something that is altogether primordial, unrestrained and untamed. Some of our giants whisper of Celtic influences. Others, however, seem distinctly Shropshire in design. Some are successful, whereas others are resigned to a fate that is controlled by humans or the forces of nature. We are going to explore some of these stories, travelling across the breadth of Shropshire, in hope that we can discern more about the county's wonderful folklore. The first, and arguably the most famous giant in Shropshire, is Gwendol Wrekin, ap Shenkin, ap Mindmawr. He leaps from the page, demanding our attention. So let us pay him his dues. Gwendol Wrekin ap Shenkin ap Mindmawr was a man with a grudge. By man, I mean a grumpy Welsh giant with a searing hatred of Shrewsbury and all its inhabitants. It hadn't always been that way. Once he'd had a good thing going with them. He had an agreement with the mayor of Shrewsbury that he wouldn't smash the town to pieces as long as they provided him with a steady supply of young women to eat. Obviously, the mayor didn't know he ate them, but then again, the mayor didn't really ask. The arrangement took place for some time, leaving Gwendol very satisfied. However, this was soon to change. One day a young woman was sent to him who was much cleverer than the rest. She quickly realized that her fate was sealed, noticing that no woman ever returned from their trip to the giant. Now this girl was a cunning woman. She understood the potent power of plants and herbs and concealed some on her person before her journey. When she was face to face with the giant, she offered to brew him up a tea, and stupid Gwendol agreed. The woman used the herbs and sent Gwendol into a deep slumber. So Gwendol had an early night, and the woman snuck away, not before taking note of the piles of bones and skulls that littered Gwendol's cave. When she returned to Shrewsbury, she had a few choice words to say to the mayor, including telling him all about Gwendol's appetite for Shrewsbury's womenfolk. So, from that day, the mayor never sent another woman to be eaten by a giant. How commendable! However, when Gwendol awoke and eventually realized he wasn't getting any more free meals, he became very angry. His anger grew and grew, seething inside him like coal. The people of Shrewsbury were detestable, loathsome people, and their very existence insulted him. As for that mayor, well, Gwendol decided that he hated the mayor most of all. So days passed, and his anger was all-consuming. All he could do with his time was to sit among the hills, stewing on how much he wanted to wipe Shrewsbury out of existence. Day in, day out, he imagined life without the lamentable town. Day in, day out, he tried to think of ways he could complete his task, but to no avail. Then one day, the idea struck him whilst he sat amongst the hills. It seemed so simple. He had such an easy solution to his problems. Like a lightning strike, he resolved that he had to act. Gwendol decided that he would dam the great River Severn that snaked its way through the county, past farm and field, and through Shrewsbury. Thus there would be a monumental flood, filling the streets and drowning all the town's inhabitants. Gwendol smiled at his plan, proud of his ingenuity. They would be his burden no more. So that was that. He wasted no time in rising from his hilly perch and grabbing his spade. With one great swoop he plunged it into the earth and lifted a great mound. There he began his journey. Mile after mile, Gwendol marched, barely stopping to catch his breath, spade so full that even he struggled under its weight. He knew the route well, having terrorized the local area in the past. However, as the hot sun beat down on his back, he began to tire, and he became confused. The roads all twisted and turned, and despite being taller than the hedgerows and thickets, it all looked the same. Gwendol had gotten lost. It had to be close now. Surely he had to be near. A short while later, he heard footsteps approaching. The footsteps belonged to a man, old and grey, who hobbled along, carrying a large sack of boots and shoes. The man was a cobbler and lived in the nearby town of Wellington. The cobbler would journey to Shrewsbury every day to collect customers' shoes to mend, then return home and fix them before sunrise. He had noticed Gwendol some time before, but walked without a care, pretending not to notice the big, ugly giant heading in his direction. Gwendol was tired, and at this point his wits had failed him. He just wanted the journey to be over so he could rid himself of the blasted town, and then he could rest his tired bones. So he didn't hesitate to ask the man for directions. He seemed old and inoffensive enough for all. The giant called out in an unmistakable growl, "I say, good man, you look well travelled. How far is Shrewsbury? Shrewsbury, my good man, I need to know. Tell me now." "Shrewsbury, you say?" the old man called back quizzically. He sensed that the giant was up to no good. "Whatever could you want in Shrewsbury? There isn't much there for, your kind," he replied, looking up at the giant. Now, Gwendol wasn't well known for his intelligence. Not many giants are, so he quickly gave away his plan. He was proud of it after all, and all the labour of the journey that had made his senses dim further. "I am going to Shrewsbury," he thundered, "to drop this earth into the River Severn. Then I will rid myself of that horrible town once and for all. I am going to drown them all. Ha 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 ha! That will show them." He roared, open-mouthed, spit flying everywhere. "So tell me, old man, tell me how to get to Shrewsbury, or I will squish you flat. I need to be there as soon as possible." The cobbler listened intently. Now it must be noted that he was a practical man, and he knew that if he let the giant succeed in his journey, he would be left with no customers, and no customers meant no food on the table for him and his family. He also didn't really like the idea of being squished either. So he looked up at the giant and he smiled faintly. "Well, why didn't I tell you sooner? Shrewsbury, he stretched out his old body. Shrewsbury. You won't get to Shrewsbury by sunset, that's for sure. I doubt you'll make it tomorrow either. It's a long journey and that." "What?" Gwendol shrieked. He was sure he was on the right path. He couldn't have strayed that far, could he? "If it's Shrewsbury you're after, you've wandered far from your course. said the old man. See this big bag I'm carrying? It's filled with worn-out shoes, and you can see from some of them they have holes that are that big." The giant nodded down, looking at the big sack. "Well, when I began my journey, these were shiny new shoes with thick soles, and to tell you the truth, I'm heading back to Shrewsbury myself, and I've worn out every pair but the ones I'm wearing. When I was a young fella and I began, but look at me now, old and worn out. It's a long road. I still have to travel miles, and gosh, that certainly looks like a heavy burden to carry all that way, especially in the sun." This infuriated Gwendol. How could he have been so foolish? He shouted and he growled and he stomped his feet. "I will never meant to carry this blasted load. I will never make it in time. Oh, cursed foolish Gwendol!" He continued to shout, getting angrier and angrier, and suddenly he dropped the spade violently, the earth falling to the floor with a monumental crash, creating a large mound. Then Gwendol scraped his boot on the spade and left the cobbler. He was angry and embarrassed and stomped his way all the way back to Wales. He was never seen again. Perhaps his attention was diverted by some other means, or perhaps he's still in the hills, trying to think up the perfect plan. The earth Gwendol dropped still stands to this day, and has grown to be two great hills called the Wrekin and Little Urcall by locals. They stand as testament to the giant's attempts and as a memorial to the quick-witted cobbler. One can only assume that he continued down the road and continued to keep his customers happy. I adore this story, and it is perhaps the first piece of Shropshire folklore I can remember being told. However, Gwendol is not the only giant associated with a Wrekin. Indeed, there is another origin story, puts not one, but two giants at the centre of the narrative. The second Wrekin giant tale states that there was once a pair of giants that had recently come to inhabit the area. They soon set themselves the task of building a home to live in, as even giants need shelter. After some discussion, they settled on the idea of building a hill, which they could then hollow out and live in the centre. They set to work, and rather quickly they had piled up enough earth to create the Wrekin. However, the giants soon began to quarrel, as giants often do, trying to decide if they should build the mound higher or leave it as it is. The quarrel quickly descended into violence, with one of the giants reaching for his spade and striking his friend with it across the face. The stricken giant fought back, throwing fists and clods of earth at his aggressor, who was still brandishing his weapon. The fight was monumental and could be heard as far as the Clee Hills. Amongst the ruckus, a raven had sat watching the fight unfold. Soon enough he took to his wings and attacked the aggressive giant, pecking at his eyes with great ferocity. The pain was too much to bear. The giant cried out in pain, and a tear fell from his blood-stained eye, which hollowed out a little basin in the rock, which even to this day is always filled with water. The other giant struck again, knocking his friend clean out. This meant that he'd won the battle. He was triumphant. To celebrate, he built the Urkel Hill and used it to imprison his former friend. Here the giant remains to this day, still entombed in the hill, and if you listen close enough, you may still hear his groans. Let us go to the Clee Hills now, an iconic area which even features on the Mappa Mundi. The whole area is drenched in folklore, with associations with witches and fairies, amongst other things. It is also the site of a colossal battle which defined an age. Indeed, the summit of Titterstone Clee is listed by both Augustus Hare and Charlotte Byrne as being the site of the Battle of the Giants. Still to this day there are a number of stones which are scattered across the landscape, relics of this battle. Rival giants came from all over to do battle upon the hill, which saw many casualties. Also on Brown Clee Hill there is a large monolith known as Giant's Shaft, which is said to be the shaft of an arrow which was once fired by a giant during this battle. One cannot help but picture this wonderful scene, and wonder what event inspired it. We will travel down to Stokesay Castle now, which is the home of another pair of unfortunate giants. Stokesay Castle is a beautiful building set in a landscape that feels untouched by the ravages of time. I would definitely recommend a visit if you haven't been. The castle and all of the countryside around it once belonged to two giants, a pair of brothers who lived upon the view edge. The brothers got on cordially and shared their land as well as the rich treasure they had equally held. They kept their vast wealth in a big oak chest in the vault of the castle, and whenever one of them wanted something from the vault, they simply took the key and got whatever they needed out, taking the key with them afterwards for safe keeping. If the other brother wanted to use the vault, they would shout over, and the key would be tossed over. This happened for some time, and the key would be tossed backwards and forwards whenever it was needed. One day this would prove to be a big mistake. One of the giants wanted the key, so he shouted to his brother as he usually did. The other giant absent-mindedly threw the key, not really paying attention, and the time he threw it, it was too short, and it landed in the moat of the castle. Both giants shouted in shock, sending earthquakes rumbling through the land. The brothers searched and searched, trying every way to find the key, but it was as if it had disappeared into thin air. The giants were in a tumult, desperately trying to find the key which had sunk deep to the depths below. They never found that key. Some suggest they are still searching on lonely nights when the moon is full. They never lived as comfortably again, instead having to hide away from the watchful eyes of the world. The chest of treasures is purported to still lie deep in the vaults below Stokesay, and is guarded by a great big raven. The raven is a fierce guardian who will not let anyone near the chest until the key is discovered. There are further references to giants around the Llanmynech area. The beautiful hill is honeycombed with mine shafts and passages which potentially date from as early as 200 BC. Here history and folklore entwine, with the area being the site of mining from the Roman period. One of these abandoned mines, Ogor's Hall, is said to be an entrance to fairyland, and the stories of the fae and goblins litter the landscape. It is also home to a very special burial. Locals speak of this burial as having taken place on the Shropshire side of the hill. There is a mound on the hill known as Be the Cawr, the giant's grave, where a giant carefully buried his wife. He dug out the grave himself and laid her to rest with a vast treasure, including a beautiful golden circlet around her neck. She was said to be quite beautiful, and the giant loved her dearly. After she was interred here, he went far away, unable to deal with being close to her grave. Locals soon began to speak of this treasure, and implored each other to search for it, but to no avail. However, one story states that there were 3 men who actually got close to finding it, These 3 men were brothers who, after some searching, managed to get to the capstone which blocked up the tomb. Realizing they were close, they began to laugh and sing jovially, boasting of what they would do with the treasure. As they began to move the capstone, they were suddenly struck dead by some unnamed force, angry at them for having disrespected the solemn nature of the place. No one has since come close to uncovering the treasure hidden beneath that hill. The area surrounding Weston under Redcastle and Hawkstone Park are also the home of giants as well as Arthurian connections. These giants are known as Tarquin and Tarquinius, who are said to have ruled Redcastle alongside their brother Carados. These giants were characterized by their cruelty, and once captured Sir Gawain when he was out riding. When Sir Lancelot and Sir Tristan heard of Gawain's fate, they quickly set off to try and free him from the giant's clutches. Soon enough they found their friend in the clutches of Carados, who was carrying Sir Gawain tied across his saddle. A fight ensued, and both men using all of their strength to defeat the giant. Sir Lancelot delivered the killing blow, killing Carados near the church, and thus freeing Gawain. The giant brothers fled from the land and were never seen again. I think it's wonderful to think that when we wander around Shropshire, we might well be walking in the footsteps of the legends themselves. There are also fragments of folklore which concern themselves with the existence of giants. These are by no means full stories, but play a part in understanding the role of the giant's narrative in Shropshire. For example, folklore states that soon after the Romans left the Roman city of Viroconium, it became overrun by giants. This made the crumbling ruins a no-go area, lest you come into conflict or even be consumed by these ungodly creatures. Here they could symbolize the lack of certainty and control that comes with such a fall, and could represent the landscape descending into banditry and lawlessness. We have now come to the end of our journey, having charted some of the examples of giant folklore in Shropshire. This is by no means exhaustive, but I hope it has been interesting and goes part of the way in identifying how these stories interact with the landscape around us. Giants are our hills and wild landscapes, unfettered beings that encourage us to embrace our freedom. They represent the part of the world that we couldn't tame, and yet they are often clumsy, stupid, and consumed with too much pride, which eventually leads to their downfall. This should be seen as a reminder of the importance of humility. Stories like Gwendol's remind us to question everything, and that even the humblest of cobblers can defeat that which is far bigger than him. I also believe such stories implore us to dream. Dream of things that are bigger and wilder than ourselves. And that is wonderful.